Okay, this section of the textbook is called Immigration and Modern Urban Growth. And the first heading says One American Story. In 1907, a 10-year-old Edward Corsi left Italy to come to America. After 2 weeks at sea, he saw the Statue of Liberty. This symbol of America inspired awe in the hopeful immigrants. Many older persons among us, burdened with 1,000 memories of what they were leaving behind, had been openly weeping. Now, somehow steadied, I suppose, by the concreteness of the symbol of America's freedom, they dried their tears. This was said by Edward Corsi in The Shadow of Liberty. Edward Corsi was one of millions of immigrants who came to the United States in the years between 1890 and 1920. Most of these immigrants settled in America's growing cities. The next part says, industrialization changes cities. And the key question for this part says, how did industry and new inventions change society? New materials and inventions help speed industrial growth. This growth caused far-reaching changes in American society. The rest of this is kind of hard to read because the page got folded over when it was scanned, so I'm going to skip to the next section, which says skyscrapers. In the late 1800s, a new type of building called the skyscraper helped cities absorb millions of people. Skyscrapers looked tall enough to scrape the sky. They increased the amount of housing and workspace available within cities. One invention that made it possible to build skyscrapers was the electric elevator. Before the 1860s, buildings were rarely more than 4 stories high because many people didn't want to climb more stairs than that. In 1889, Otis Elevator Company installed the first electric elevator. Buildings could now be more than a few stories tall. The use of steel also helped engineers construct taller buildings. In 1885, the Home Insurance Building in Chicago boasted an iron and steel skeleton that could hold the immense weight of the skyscraper's floors and walls. The building climbed to 10 stories. Skyscrapers changed city skylines forever. The next section says streetcars and suburbs. Just as electricity changed the way people lived inside buildings, it also changed the way they traveled around cities. Before industrialization, people walked or used horse-drawn vehicles to travel over land. But by 1900, electric streetcars in American cities were carrying more than 5 billion passengers a year. By allowing workers to live further away from their jobs, public transportation helped new suburbs develop. It also helped cities expand. Some suburbs wanted to merge with the city that they bordered in order to be served by the city's transportation system. In 1889, Chicago annexed several suburbs and more than doubled its population and area. The next section reads, The New Immigrants. And the key question here is, who were the new immigrants and where did they settle in the United States? Until the 1890s, most immigrants to the United States had come from Northern and Western Europe. But after 1896, immigrants came mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe, including Southern Italy, Poland, and Russia. This later group became known as the New Immigrants. New arrivals. For most European immigrants, Ellis Island was the first stop. There they were processed before they could enter the United States. First, they had to pass a physical examination. Those with serious health problems were sent home. Immigrants who passed the physical were then asked for their name, occupation, and financial situation. In 1910, Asian immigrants began to land at Angel Island in San Francisco. In Angel Island's filthy buildings, most Chinese immigrants were held for weeks. Many Mexican immigrants entered the United States through Texas. Finding work and housing. American cities such as New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago attracted immigrants with the promise of jobs. Newer immigrants looked for people from the old country to help them find jobs and housing. People with similar ethnic backgrounds often moved to the same neighborhoods. As a result, ethnic neighborhoods with names like Little Italy and Chinatown became common in American cities. While European immigrants settled mostly in the East and Midwest, Asian immigrants settled mostly in the West. Many Chinese immigrants worked on the railroads. Others settled in Western cities. Japanese immigrants first came to Hawaii in 1868 to work on sugar plantations. Others settled on the mainland, where they commonly fished, farmed, or worked in mines. Immigrants from Mexico came to the Southwest. Mexican immigration increased after 1910, when revolution in that country forced many people to flee. Many Mexican immigrants found work on ranches in California and Texas or in Arizona copper mines. This section reads Reactions to Immigration. And the key question is, what did native-born Americans fear about immigration? Immigrants were eager to become part of their new country. However, many native-born Americans regarded immigrants as a threat. Americanization and prejudice. Some Americans have described the United States as a melting pot, or a place where cultures blend. The new immigrants blended into American society as earlier immigrants had. This process of blending into society is called assimilation. To assimilate, new immigrants studied English and how to be American citizens. Many workers began to assimilate in order to get and retain work. Employers and labor unions both tried to Americanize immigrant workers by offering classes in citizenship and English. Yet, at the same time that immigrants were learning about America, they were also changing America. Immigrants did not give up their cultures right away. Bits and pieces of immigrant languages, foods, and music worked their way into the rest of American culture. Despite their efforts to assimilate, immigrants faced prejudice from native-born Americans. Many Protestants feared the arrival of Catholics and Jews. Other native-born Americans thought immigrants would not fit into democratic society because they would be controlled by politicians. Such prejudices led some native-born Americans to push for restrictions on the numbers of new immigrants. Restrictions on immigration. Many native-born Americans also feared they would have to compete with immigrants for jobs. Immigrants often took whatever jobs they could get, working for long hours, low wages, and in unsafe conditions. Many found jobs in sweatshops, hot, crowded, dangerous factories, for about $10 a week. Some Americans worried that there would not be enough jobs for everyone. These fears led to increased opposition to immigration. In 1882, Congress began to pass laws to restrict immigration. They placed taxes on new immigrants and banned specific groups such as convicts and people with mental illness. Non-whites faced deeper prejudice than European immigrants, and Asians faced some of the worst. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It banned Chinese immigration for 10 years. Immigration and racism. The Chinese Exclusion Act was not the only example of prejudice in America around 1900. Chinese immigrants who came to the West in the 1800s also faced severe discrimination. Chinese laborers received lower wages than whites for the same work. Sometimes, Chinese workers faced violence. In 1885, white workers in Rock Springs, Wyoming, refused to work in the same mine as Chinese workers. The whites stormed through the Chinese part of town, killing 28 Chinese people. At the same time, Mexicans and African Americans who came to the American Southwest were forced into peonage. In this system of labor, people are forced to work until they have paid off debts. Congress outlawed peonage in 1867, but some workers were still forced to work to repay debts. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court declared such labor to be the same as peonage. As a result, the court struck down such forms of labor as a violation of the 13th Amendment. This section says problems of urbanization. And the key question is, what problems were caused by urbanization? The growing population of the cities led to overcrowding and disease. Soon, political organizations and reformers were working to improve conditions. Urban disasters and slums. The concentration of people in cities increased the danger of disaster because people and buildings were packed closely together. For example, in 1906, a powerful earthquake rocked San Francisco, destroying the central business district and killing about 700 people. Natural disasters were not the only danger for city dwellers. Poverty and disease also threatened lives. Many people lived in tenements, run down and overcrowded apartment houses. Old buildings, landlord neglect, poor design, and little government control led to dangerous conditions in many tenements. Inadequate garbage pickup also caused problems. Tenants sometimes dumped their smelly garbage into the narrow air shafts between tenements. Many tenements had no running water. Residents had to collect water from a faucet on the street. The water could be heated for bathing, but it was often unsafe for drinking. Sewage flowed in open gutters and threatened to spread disease among tenement dwellers. A neighborhood with such overcrowded, dangerous housing was called a slum. The most famous example was New York City's Lower East Side, but every city had slums. Reformers attack urban problems. Many Americans were disgusted by poverty in slums. Urban reformers fought for changes that would solve these problems. Some reformers opened settlement houses to help immigrants and the poor improve their lives. Settlement houses offered daycare, education, and health care to needy people in slums. Many settlement house founders were educated middle-class women. Jane Addams, an urban reformer and suffrage leader, founded Chicago's Hull House in 1889 with Ellen Gates Starr. Hull House became a model for other settlement houses. In 1893, Lillian D. Wald founded the Henry Street Settlement House in New York. Some reformers were inspired by the social gospel movement, which was based on Christian values and led by Protestant ministers. The movement worked for labor reforms, such as abolishing child labor. Political machines run cities. Political machines were another type of organization that addressed the problems of the city. A political machine is an illegal gang that influences enough votes to control a local government. Political machines gained support by trading favors for votes. Machine bosses gave jobs, cash, or food to supporters. In return, supporters voted for the machine. Political machines did many other illegal things. They broke rules to win elections. They demanded bribes and used extortion, or threats, to affect government actions. The most famous political machine was Tammany Hall in New York City. It was led by William Marcy Tweed. Along with his greedy friends, Boss Tweed stole enormous amounts of money from the city. Despite such corruption, political machines did a number of good things. They built parks, sewers, schools, roads, and orphanages in many cities. Machine politicians often helped immigrants get settled by helping them find jobs or homes. Many immigrants gratefully supported the political machine after this kind of help. Okay, and that's the end of this section.